My name is Celia Foster. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. The morning it all changed began like every other Tuesday in October. I was sitting at my kitchen table in my small apartment in San Diego, grading a stack of sophomore essays on The Great Gatsby with a red pen in one hand and a mug of coffee going cold in the other. The sun was just coming up, pale and thin through the window above the sink, the kind of autumn light that never fully commits. It suggests warmth without delivering it. My apartment was small, but mine. One bedroom, a galley kitchen, a living room just large enough for a couch and a bookshelf that I'd filled twice over. No dishwasher. A bathroom with a shower head that ran cold for the first 45 seconds every morning without exception. I had lived there for 4 years, and I knew its rhythms the way you know a person, which floorboards creaked, which drawers stuck in humid weather, which window let in a draft on windy nights. I was 28 years old. I taught sophomore English and AP Literature at Jefferson High School, 12 minutes from my apartment. I made $52,000 a year, had $4,200 in my checking account, $11,000 in savings, and a student loan balance I tried not to think about before my first cup of coffee. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that, because the story I'm about to tell you might make it sound like I was living in quiet misery, waiting to be rescued. I wasn't. I loved my classroom. I loved the moment a student understood something they'd been fighting with, the way their face would shift just slightly from frustration to recognition. I loved the stillness of grading at 6 a.m. with the city still half asleep outside. But there was a shape to my family that I had learned to live around the way you learn to walk without putting weight on a bruised heel. You don't think about it constantly, you just adjust. In the Foster family, there were people who occupied the center of the room and people who stood at the edges. My father, Mitchell, was a center of the room person. My mother, Luciana, had built her entire identity around being close to the center. My brother Ryan, at 31, had inherited my father's assumption that the center was simply where he belonged. And then there was me. I had spent 28 years understanding, without anyone ever saying it directly, that I was the edge of the room Foster, the one who was reliable and quiet and good with details, the one who got good grades but didn't talk about them much, the one who called on birthdays, remembered what everyone liked to eat, and never made scenes. I was useful in the background the way a good lamp is useful. Noticed only when it stopped working. My grandfather, Edward, was the exception. Edward Foster had built his life from nothing, starting with a single small hotel in San Diego when he was 35 years old, bootstrapping it by working the front desk himself on overnight shifts while managing renovations during the day. He was not a warm man in the conventional sense. He didn't give easy hugs or say I love you unprompted, but he paid attention. He paid attention the way a scientist pays attention to data, carefully, without projection, interested in what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. From the time I was 12, I spent every other Saturday afternoon at his house on Maple Ridge Drive. Not because anyone arranged it, it simply became a habit that neither of us ever questioned. We played chess on the sun porch, a game I was mediocre at and never improved much, and we talked. Not about school or grades or what I wanted to be when I grew up. He never asked me that. Instead, he asked me what I thought. You stayed at the Marriott last month for Aunt Patricia's wedding, he said once when I was about 16. What did you notice? About what? Anything. What did you observe? I thought about it seriously. The way he always made me feel was worth doing. The staff at the front desk smiled when they saw you coming, but their eyes didn't really change, like the smile was practiced. But the woman who cleaned the hallways, she said good morning to everyone and actually looked at them. He was quiet for a moment, then, and what does that tell you? That the cleaning woman likes her job more than the front desk staff does. Or maybe she's just a naturally warm person. But either way, she's the one making people feel welcome, not the people who are supposed to. He looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for then. Satisfaction, maybe. The specific satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to be said and has finally heard it said correctly. Remember that, he told me. I always wondered what I was supposed to do with those conversations. They didn't feel like lessons exactly. They felt more like deposits. Yeah, like he was putting something aside for later. But for what? I never knew. I was thinking about one of those afternoons when my phone buzzed on the kitchen table. Mom. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. It was not yet 7 in the morning. Your grandfather passed last night. Her voice was measured, organized, the voice she used when she had already processed an emotion and moved past it into logistics. The reading of the will is Thursday afternoon, 2 o'clock, Daniel Hartley's office downtown. You need to be there. There was a pause that I waited through. No, are you okay? No, I know you were close to him. She wasn't being cruel. That simply wasn't the architecture of our relationship. The part where she checked on me. I'll be there, I said. Dress appropriately. It's a formal reading. And then, softer, an afterthought. He was 91 years old, Celia. He had a long life. She hung up. I set my phone down on top of the stack of ungraded essays. Outside the window, the October light was still pale and uncommitted. I reached across the table and touched the small frame photograph I kept there. It was the only personal item I'd put on the kitchen table. Everything else was function. But that photo had lived on whatever table I owned since I was 18. It showed me and my grandfather standing in front of a large building I didn't recognize. A grand facade of cream-colored stone with tall windows and what looked like a terrace above the entrance. I was maybe 12 or 13 in the photo, squinting into the sun with my arm around his waist. He was looking at the building, not the camera, with an expression I had looked at so many times and never fully decoded. I had asked him once, years later, where the photo was taken. He'd smiled and said, "Somewhere that matters." That was all he ever said about it. I picked up my red pen. I set it down again. I didn't grade another essay that morning. Daniel Hartley's office occupied the 14th floor of a downtown building that had been built to communicate permanence. Dark marble in the elevator lobby, walnut paneling in the hallways, the kind of carpeting that absorbs sound so completely that even your own footsteps seem to apologize for existing. I arrived at 1:52 on Thursday afternoon. The receptionist led me down a corridor and opened a heavy door into a conference room with a long mahogany table, a window that ran the length of one wall, and 5 people already seated. My mother, Luciana, sat nearest the window in a black wrap dress that had not been purchased for grief. Her hair was pinned back precisely, her posture upright, her expression composed into something between solemnity and anticipation. She was 55 years old, and she had learned long ago that composure in the right room was its own kind of currency. My father, Mitchell, sat at the head of the near end of the table, not because he had been directed there, I suspected, but because he simply sat wherever felt like the head. He was 58, lean and deliberate in the way of men who have run things for a long time and made their peace with it. He was looking at his phone when I entered. He glanced up briefly and nodded. My brother Ryan sprawled in the chair to Mitchell's left with the specific quality of ease that only comes from never having seriously doubted your right to take up space. He was 31, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that had opened enough doors early in his life that he'd stopped wondering whether he was actually good at anything. He had one earbud in. The other dangled against his collar. Across the table, my cousin Olivia Hargrove sat beside her husband Derek. Olivia was 33, 2 years younger than Ryan, 5 years older than me, the daughter of my grandfather's younger sister, who had died when Olivia was a teenager. Grandfather had always included Olivia in family gatherings, and she had understood, I thought, that her position in his orbit was something to be maintained rather than taken for granted. She was leaning toward Derek right now, speaking very quietly, and from where I stood, I could see that she had printed out something on a sheet of paper and was going over it with the tip of her finger. I took the chair at the far end of the table, the chair nobody had been drawn to. Daniel Hartley entered at exactly 2 o'clock. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, the kind of attorney who had spent so many decades in rooms like this that he no longer needed to perform gravitas. It simply emanated. He set a leather portfolio on the table, nodded at everyone without pausing on any one face, and sat down. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I'll proceed directly." He opened the portfolio. This is the last will and testament of Edward James Foster, executed in accordance with California law, witnessed and notarized as required. He cleared his throat. The room was very quiet. To my son, Mitchell Allen Foster. I leave my full controlling interest in Coastal Bridge Logistics, including all associated assets, equipment, and intellectual property. The estimated value of this bequest, based on the most recent independent appraisal, is $32 million. Mitchell's expression didn't change. He simply set his phone face down on the table. To my daughter-in-law, Luciana Elena Foster. I leave the residential property at 1140 Vineyard Lane, Napa Valley, including all furnishings, personal property, and the artwork collection housed therein. The estimated value of this bequest is $22 million. My mother pressed her lips together in something that was not quite a smile, but was in the direction of one. To my grandson, Ryan Mitchell Foster, I leave the personal vehicle collection currently housed at the Rancho Santa Fe storage facility and the condominium unit at 3300 Collins Avenue, Miami Beach, Florida. The combined estimated value of these bequests is $9 million. Ryan pulled out his second earbud and set it on the table. To my great-niece, Olivia Jean Hargrove, née Porter, I leave the vessel currently registered as the Lighthouse and the residential property at 88 Palm Crest Drive, Palm Beach, Florida. The combined estimated value of these bequests is $11 million. Olivia folded her printed sheet once. I watched her hands. Daniel Hartley turned a page. He looked up, not at the room generally, but specifically at me at the end of the table. To my granddaughter, Celia Ann Foster, I leave the enclosed envelope. He reached into the portfolio and placed a white envelope on the table. It was standard size, sealed, with my name written on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. That was all. The room held a silence for what was probably 3 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then Ryan made a sound, not a laugh exactly, more like the small exhale of someone whose prediction has just been confirmed. He leaned back and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way people do when they are trying not to say something. My mother turned to me. She placed her hand over mine on the table. The gesture was so textbook sympathetic that I felt absurdly like I was watching it happen to someone else. "I'm sure it's something sentimental, sweetheart," she said. "He probably wrote you a letter. You know how he was." "He was 91, my father said from the other end of the table, in the tone of a man offering context, not comfort. Olivia looked down at the envelope and back at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be kind and landing just slightly to the left of it. "A handwritten letter from him is actually very special, Celia. Some things are worth more than property." I looked at Olivia. I looked at the envelope. "I need some air," I said. I pushed my chair back. The legs dragged across the floor and the sound was too loud. I picked up the envelope, held it at my side, and walked toward the door. "She's always been sensitive," I heard my mother say behind me, quietly to someone. And then Ryan's voice, not especially lowered. "Hope it's at least a really good letter." I walked out. The elevator at Daniel Hartley's office had mirrored walls, floor to ceiling, 6 panels of polished steel that reflected everything back at you whether you wanted it or not. I stepped in and pressed the lobby button. The doors closed. I was alone with 8 versions of myself in an ill-fitting black blazer I'd bought 3 years ago for a job interview and hadn't worn since. The envelope was in my hand. I could feel something inside it. Not just paper. There was a slight rigidity, a faint thickness that didn't belong to a folded letter alone. I had noticed it in the conference room but hadn't let myself focus on it. I looked at my name and his handwriting on the front. He had beautiful handwriting for a man who had never finished college. Precise, slightly slanted, the letters evenly formed as if he'd been taught by someone who believed that the quality of your penmanship was a direct statement about the quality of your mind. I opened the envelope. 3 things inside. The first was a plane ticket. I unfolded it slowly. Air France, business class. Departing San Diego in 7 days, connecting through New York, arriving Nice, Côte d'Azur. Return open-ended. I read it twice. Then I set it against my palm and took out the second item. A small card, cream-colored stock, like a business card but thicker. On the front, Sebastian Whitmore President, Whitmore Capital Geneva. Monaco, New York. On the back, in my grandfather's handwriting, 4 words. "He manages your trust." I stared at those 4 words for a long moment. Then I took out the third item. It was a single-page bank statement. The letterhead was in French and German, with the name of a private Swiss institution I didn't recognize. At the top of the statement, the account was identified as Foster Legacy Trust, Celia Ann Foster, beneficiary. I looked at the balance line. I looked at it again. I counted the digits. $618 million. $618 million. The elevator arrived at the lobby. The doors opened. I stood inside the elevator and did not move. A man in a suit stepped toward the elevator from the lobby, saw me standing motionless in the center of it, and stepped back to wait. The doors closed again. The elevator went back up. I counted the zeros again. 6, 3 followed by 8 zeros after the 6, 18. I folded the statement very carefully and held it against my sternum as if pressure might help me understand it. The elevator went up to the 14th floor. The doors opened. No one was waiting. The doors closed. It went back down. In those 30 seconds between floors, I stood completely still, and the 8 reflections of me in the mirrored walls stood still too, all of us holding the same piece of paper, none of us quite sure who we were looking at. I drove home in a state that I can only describe as a sustained state of not yet. My hands were steady on the wheel. I stopped at red lights. I parked in my building's lot, walked up the stairs, unlocked my apartment door, and sat down on the floor of my hallway with my back against the wall because I didn't have the momentum to get any further. The 3 items from the envelope were spread across my lap: the ticket, the card, the statement. After a while, I don't know how long, 20 minutes perhaps, I got up, sat at the kitchen table, and called the number printed at the bottom of the bank statement. It took 3 transfers and 2 rounds of security questions to reach a person who could actually speak with me. The questions were specific and strange: the name of the elementary school I attended, my maternal grandmother's maiden name, the make and color of a car my grandfather had once driven. These were not things anyone could have guessed. They were things that could only have been gathered deliberately, over time, by someone who knew me. The voice on the other end, when I finally reached him, belonged to a man who introduced himself as a client services associate at the bank's private wealth division. His English was excellent, and his tone was the careful neutral of someone trained to deliver surprising information without inflection. Yes, Miss Foster. The Foster Legacy Trust account is confirmed. You are the sole name beneficiary. The account has been active for 10 years. 10 years, I said. Since I was 18. Correct. The trust was established by the settlor, Mr. Edward James Foster, when you reached legal majority. At that time, assets were transferred in and placed under professional management. The trust instrument specified that the full extent of the trust and its assets would only be disclosed to the beneficiary upon her 28th birthday, or upon the settlor's death, whichever came first. My grandfather died last Tuesday, I said. Yes. Our condolences, Miss Foster. And I looked at the bank statement on the table. The $618 million, that's the liquid balance, the cash and liquid holdings. Correct. And the total value of the trust, including non-liquid assets, is different. A brief pause. Mr. Whitmore will be better positioned to walk you through the full portfolio. The liquid balance represents roughly 60% of the trust's current net value. For a complete picture, we strongly recommend the meeting in Monaco. I sat with that for a moment. The $5,000 a month, I said, the deposit I've been receiving since I was 18 from the Educational Foundation. That disbursement originates from the trust, yes, structured as a recurring educational and living support distribution, classified under the Trust Charitable Giving Authorization. It was fully reported to the IRS each year through the trust tax filings. Your personal tax returns would have included it as a gift-type distribution. Your accountant would have handled the classification. I thought back. I had a small firm accountant I paid $200 a year to do my taxes. He always categorized that monthly deposit as a charitable distribution from a private family foundation. I had never questioned it because my grandfather had told me when I was 18 that he was putting aside a small educational fund for me. Nothing extravagant, just something to keep the lights on while you're figuring things out. And the $5,000 a month had always felt like exactly that. A little more than I expected, but not unimaginably so. I had lived simply, saved some of it, spent some of it, and never once examined where it actually came from. For 10 years, the assets that would one day belong to me had been paying for my groceries, my rent, and my classroom supplies. Thank you, I said. I'll arrange travel to Monaco. And after I hung up, I sat at my table for a long time without moving. The October dark had settled fully outside my window. The essays were still on the table, red pen capped beside them. On top of the stack, the half-graded essay I'd abandoned that morning still had its last comment mid-sentence. Your analysis of the green light is strong, but consider. I thought about what my grandfather had done. Not the amount, not yet, the architecture of it. He had watched me. For years he had watched me in that particular attentive way of his, asking me what I thought, listening to my answers, filing them away. He had decided at some point that there was something in me worth protecting. Not by handing it to me, but by leaving it alone long enough to grow into its own shape. He had known my family. He had known that if I walked into that room at 28, already certain of $1 billion, I would become, overnight, a different kind of target. I would never again know which conversations were genuine. I would never know who had liked me before I had something they wanted. And so he waited. He gave me 10 years of a real life. real constraints, real choices, real uncertainty, before he handed me anything. I understood sitting in my small apartment at 10:30 on a Thursday night that my grandfather's final gift to me was not the money. It was the decade without it. My parents had a standing Saturday morning breakfast, a habit from when Ryan and I were growing up that had persisted long past necessity. My mother made eggs and sliced fruit and set the table properly. My father read the Wall Street Journal on his tablet while eating. Ryan came when he felt like it, which lately was more often than not, since he'd been between jobs and living off the vintage car collection our grandfather had apparently already been planning to leave him. I came most Saturdays because it was habit and because some part of me was still trying, in the quiet, persistent way of middle children who never fully give up, to find the version of my family where I fit naturally. This Saturday, 6 days after the will reading, I came with the Air France ticket in my purse. "I'm thinking of taking that trip," I said, when the eggs were on the table and the first round of coffee poured. "To Monaco, the ticket grandfather left." My father looked up from his tablet. Monaco. He said it the way you say a foreign word you've heard but never spoken, carefully, like you're not sure of the pronunciation. "Celia, that's a 10-hour flight, 11 with the connection. The hotels there cost, the ticket is already paid for, business class." A small silence. "Business class," my mother repeated. She had a way of repeating phrases that made them sound both more absurd and more specifically directed at you. "To Monaco. He planned it," I said. "Planned it. It wasn't random. He had the ticket in the envelope for a reason." Ryan was spreading jam on toast at the counter, not sitting, the way he always ate breakfast, as if committing to a chair would make it a more significant event than he wanted it to be. "Monaco's a 40-minute drive from Nice," he said, without turning around. "It's basically a casino on a cliff. Billionaires and European royalty. Why would Grandpa send you there?" "I don't know yet. That's why I'm going." "How long?" my father asked. "A week, maybe 2. I'll use personal days." My mother set down her fork. "Celia, your grandfather was a sentimental man in his later years. I don't want you to fly to Monaco expecting something meaningful and come home disappointed. Whatever he arranged, it was sweet of him, but you shouldn't read too much into it." I looked at her. She was 55 years old, and she had been trying to love me in the only way she knew how for all 28 years of my life, which was a way that made slightly too much room for her own comfort and slightly too little for mine. I didn't blame her for it anymore, but I had finally stopped waiting for it to change. "He had a reason," I said again. "He was 91, my father said, not unkindly. "Celia, toward the end, he wasn't. He was completely clear," I said. My voice was steady and quiet in a way that surprised all of us, including me. "I spoke with him 7 weeks ago. He talked to me for 2 hours about interest rate dynamics in the commercial real estate market and the long-term effect of automation on port logistics. He was not confused." My father looked at me for a moment, then he picked up his tablet. Ryan turned from the counter and finally looked at me, really looked for the first time all morning. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite calculation and wasn't quite curiosity, and landed somewhere in the uncomfortable space between them. "Did Grandpa ever talk to you about business stuff?" he asked. "Like, regularly?" "Every time I saw him." Ryan blinked. "He never talked to me about business." "I know," I said. There was a silence at the table that none of us knew what to do with. "Well," my mother said finally, in her most decisive social smoothing voice, "I suppose if the ticket is already paid for, it would be wasteful not to go. Take photos. Monaco is supposed to be beautiful in the fall." I finished my coffee. I thanked her for breakfast. I hugged them both in the way I always had. Fully, with one arm briefly tightening, a gesture of genuine affection that had nothing to do with how seen I felt. In the car on the way home, I called Emily Weston. "I'm going to Monaco on Tuesday," I said. "Monaco," said Emily. "Like the place?" "There's only one." "And why?" "My grandfather arranged it. Emily, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen for a minute without saying anything." "That's a sentence that has never once led anywhere calm," she said. "Okay, go," I told her. Not everything. Not the numbers, not the full scope of it, just the shape of it, the envelope, the ticket, the call with the bank, the name Sebastian Whitmore. Emily was quiet for a long time. Then, "Celia." "I know." "Do you need me to come?" "No." I think I need to do this part alone. Another pause. Call me when you land. I will. And Celia? Yeah? He saw you, Emily said. He always saw you. This is proof. I drove the rest of the way home without music, and I thought about what she said and whether being seen was enough, and decided that it wasn't. Not by itself, but that it was the beginning of everything else. The business class cabin on Air France Flight 68 was quiet after takeoff, most passengers pulling on their eye shades and settling into sleep the way experienced long-haul travelers do, efficiently, without ceremony. I did not sleep. I sat at the window seat, 4A, which had been reserved in my name, and watched San Diego fall away beneath the cloud layer and disappear. Outside, the Pacific stretched dark and immense to the west, and ahead, somewhere across the continent and the ocean, Monaco was already in tomorrow. The flight attendant brought champagne before the meal. I held the glass without drinking it, looking at the tiny bubbles rising in the dim light. I had an email from Sebastian Whitmore in my inbox. 2 paragraphs, professional, warm without being familiar. He confirmed our meeting for the morning after my arrival. He had arranged a car from the airport. He looked forward to the opportunity to discuss the full scope of my grandfather's arrangements, and he extended his condolences on my loss. Your grandfather was not only a client, he wrote at the end. He was someone I respected greatly. I hope this meeting will begin to explain why. I read it 3 times, then put my phone away and opened the tray table. My grandfather had been 52 years old when he first met Sebastian Whitmore. I knew this from the brief biography I'd found in a financial journal profile. Sebastian Whitmore at 55, the quiet manager of quiet fortunes. The article described Whitmore Capital as a firm that specialized in long-horizon wealth management for families who think in generations rather than quarters. It mentioned that the firm had been managing assets for a small number of families for over 2 decades. My grandfather, by the time he was 52, had already been in the hospitality industry for 17 years. He had built a regional portfolio of hotels and service properties in California and the Pacific Northwest, grown it methodically, never borrowed more than he could cover, and, according to the same financial database where I found the profile, had an estimated net worth in the low tens of millions at that point in his life. In the 27 years between meeting Sebastian Whitmore and his death at 79, that portfolio had grown into something else entirely. Something that now, apparently, belonged to me. I tried to imagine the person who had built that, the 35-year-old version of him, working the front desk overnight so he could renovate during the day. The 52-year-old who looked at what he'd built and decided it was time to think beyond himself, beyond his own lifetime, and began to plan for a granddaughter who was not yet a teenager. I thought about all the chess games, all the questions he asked me that I thought were just conversation. The way he listened, not waiting for me to finish so he could talk, but actually listening. The way I had tried to teach my students to listen, as though the information mattered to you personally. He hadn't been making conversation. He'd been taking notes. Somewhere over Kansas, the flight attendant offered to refill my champagne. I thanked her and said no. I took out a small notebook I carried in my bag, the same kind I use for classroom planning, narrow-ruled dark green cover. And I opened it to a clean page. At the top, I wrote, "What do I actually know how to do?" And then I wrote, slowly, the list that surprised me. I know how to observe a room and understand the people in it. I know that the people closest to the customer are usually the ones who understand the customer best. I know that genuine warmth is not teachable, but it is recognizable, and that you build a culture around the people who have it. I know that the most overlooked person in any organization is often the one who sees most clearly. I know how to listen. I looked at the list for a long time. Then the attendant brought dinner and I ate it and looked out the window at the solid black of the Atlantic below and thought about what my grandfather had been building. Not just the companies, not just the money, but the decade of preparation. The careful, unhurried architecture of a plan that was built entirely around the shape of who I was. And when I finally fell asleep somewhere over the mid-Atlantic in a seat that had been reserved in my name by a man who had loved me in the most specific, attentive, and patient way he knew how, I dreamed about a building made of cream-colored stone and tall windows, and a photograph where a girl stood in the sunlight and didn't yet know what she was looking at. The letter was still in my purse when I landed. The one the flight attendant had brought me at cruising altitude, sealed, pulled from the passenger profile, placed in my hands with a quiet, A Mr. Edward Foster arranged to have this delivered to you on this flight, Miss Foster. We held it in the flight log as requested. I had opened it there, at 37,000 feet over the middle of the ocean, and read his handwriting one more time. By the time you read this, you're on your way. That means you opened the envelope. That means you were brave enough to look. You've always been brave enough to look. I just needed you to know it too. I have always seen you, Celia, even when you thought no one was looking. The rest is yours to discover. Trust yourself the way I've trusted you. Love, Grandpa. I had folded it back up with both hands, and the woman in the seat across the aisle had pretended very politely not to notice that I was crying. The car was a dark blue Mercedes, immaculate, waiting at the arrivals exit at Nice Côte d'Azur, with a driver in a charcoal suit who held a small card printed with my name. Not a hand-lettered sign, a printed card, like the kind you find in a hotel envelope with the morning newspaper. The driver's name was Philippe. He was perhaps 60, silver at the temples, and he spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a third language and taken the process seriously. He loaded my single rolling suitcase into the trunk without comment and opened the rear door. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, he said, as we pulled onto the coastal highway. I will collect you from your hotel at 9:30, if that is agreeable. That's fine, I said. Thank you. Is this your first visit to Monaco, Miss Foster? Yes. He nodded once, as if confirming a fact he had suspected. Then perhaps you will permit me to take the coast road. It adds 6 minutes, but the first view of the harbor from the Corniche is, well, it is better to see it properly than to arrive efficiently. I said yes, and he took the longer route. He was right about the view. Monaco revealed itself gradually, the way significant things often do. First the hills rising from the shoreline, then the pale density of buildings climbing those hills in layers, and finally the harbor appearing below us as we crested a curve in the road. Boats ranked in their slips like a paragraph of short, blunt sentences. The water between them impossibly blue-green in the October morning light, and beyond it all the old city rising toward the ridge with the quiet insistence of something that has been standing in the same place for a very long time. I had expected to feel intimidated. What I felt instead was a strange, specific calm, the kind that settles over you when you arrive somewhere you didn't know you'd been heading. I thought, he came here. He stood somewhere and looked at this, and then I thought, he wanted me to see it too. Whitmore Capital occupied a building near the top of the old city that had been, in an earlier century, something residential and important. The exterior was the same cream-colored stone I had seen in the photograph. And when Philippe turned into the narrow street and I looked up at the tall windows and the carved lintel above the door, I understood for the first time what I had been looking at in that picture for 15 years. I had been standing in front of this building. I had been 12 years old, squinting into the sun, and my grandfather had been looking up at the facade with that expression I had never been able to decode. I understood it now. It was the look of a man surveying something he had built, not with his hands, but with 30 years of careful, patient decision-making. The door was opened by a young woman who led me through a corridor lined with art that was old and serious without being showy, and up a staircase to the second floor, and down a hallway to a closed door, which she knocked on twice and then opened. Miss Foster, she said, your appointment. Sebastian Whitmore was 60 years old, though he looked younger in the way of people who have never worked particularly hard at it. He was American, born in Connecticut, educated in London, based in Monaco for the past 20 years, and he carried himself with the settled ease of someone who had long ago made peace with both who he was and where he stood. He was not flashy. His suit was good, but not expensive enough to be a statement. His watch was the kind that told the time and nothing else. He came around his desk when I entered and shook my hand with both of his. Celia, he said, I'm so glad you made it. I'm Sebastian. The office was large, quiet, with a window that ran most of one wall and looked out over the rooftops toward the harbor. Morning light came through it sideways and lay across the floor in long parallel strips. He gestured to the seating area away from the desk, 2 sofas and a low table, more like a living room than an office, and we sat across from each other. Your grandfather talked about you a great deal, he said. For a man who was very private about most things, he was remarkably open on the subject of you. What did he say? Sebastian considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said you had his instincts and your own judgment, which he believed was a rarer combination than most people realized. He said you paid attention to things that most people walked past. And he said, Sebastian paused slightly, the way you do when you're deciding to include something you might otherwise have left out. He said that your family had never properly looked at you, and that this was their loss and your protection, and that the time would come when the full weight of both of those things would be clear. I sat with that for a moment. I'd like to understand the full picture, I said. Everything. He opened a folder on the table between us and began. My grandfather had entered the hospitality industry at 35 with a single property. A 30-room hotel in San Diego's Gaslamp Quarter that he had purchased for $420,000 using a combination of savings and a bank loan he'd spent 3 years qualifying for. He managed it himself for the first 4 years, learned every function of the operation from reservations to maintenance, and turned a profit in year 2. Over the next 17 years, he added properties steadily, never more than 1 per year, always California or the Pacific Northwest, always hospitality or service-adjacent commercial real estate. By the time he was 52 and met Sebastian Whitmore at a wealth management conference in San Francisco, he had an estate worth approximately $40 million and no structure in place to manage its complexity. Whitmore Capital spent the first 2 years reorganizing the portfolio, entities, tax structures, succession frameworks, and then, beginning in year 3, they began to expand it. International properties came first with a minority stake in a Monaco resort consortium, then a management partnership in Macau, then direct acquisition, property by property over the next 20 years. Your grandfather had an unusual gift, Sebastian said. He understood hospitality not as real estate, but as experience. What a guest actually needed to feel at ease, to feel valued, to return. That sounds simple. It is not simple. Most investors in this sector optimize for margin and miss the thing that drives the margin in the first place. Edward never missed it. He learned some of it from me, I said, or he was testing ideas on me. I used to think he was just being kind, asking my opinion, but he was actually using what I said. Sebastian smiled, the first fully unguarded expression he'd shown. He told me that too. He said you were the best focus group he ever had because you told him what a person actually experienced rather than what an experience was supposed to be. He turned a page in the folder. The current portfolio consists of 4 primary operating assets: the Riviera Crown Resort and Casino here in Monaco, revenue of approximately $42 million annually, occupancy consistently above 92%, the Imperial Harbor Casino Resort in Macau, annual revenue of approximately $138 million. A commercial real estate portfolio in London and Tokyo, combined current value of roughly $180 million, and a set of private equity positions in logistics and hospitality adjacent technology, various sizes. He turned another page. As of this morning, the net value of the Foster Legacy Trust is $980 million. The number sat between us on the table. I had known it was coming. The bank had prepared me for the scale of it, but hearing it spoken aloud in a quiet room by a measured man was different from reading it on a bank statement in an elevator. It had texture when it was spoken. It had weight. I'm going to need time to understand all of this, I said. Of course. And I'm going to need to see the properties. I expected you would. Ethan Laurent, the general manager of the Riviera Crown, is available to meet you this afternoon if you'd like, and I can arrange travel to Macau for later this week. Yes, I said. Both. I looked at the folder, then at Sebastian. He left instructions for you, I said, about how to handle this meeting. What did he say? Sebastian was quiet for a moment. He said, don't persuade her to do anything. Show her everything, then step back. If I'm right about her, she'll know what to do. And Sebastian, I'm right about her. I looked out the window at the harbor. The water was the same blue-green it had been from the Corniche Road, and it looked patient, the way deep water always looks patient. And I thought about a man who had spent 44 years building something and then, at the end, had simply trusted. He was right, I said. Ethan Laurent met me in the lobby of the Riviera Crown at 3 o'clock. He was 43 years old, French-American, the kind of manager who had been in hospitality long enough to have stopped being impressed by the properties themselves and started caring only about whether they functioned with integrity. He shook my hand without ceremony and began the tour without preamble, which I appreciated. The resort was on the harbor side of the old city, occupying a building that had been a hotel of some kind for over a century and had been substantially rebuilt and expanded in the years after my grandfather's trust acquired a controlling stake. 300 rooms, 5 food and beverage outlets, a spa, a small casino floor, and a terrace that in warmer months held 200 people for dinner service over the water. Ethan walked me through it the way a person who genuinely loves their work walks through it. Not showing off, but pointing out the things that mattered. The way the corridors were lit to reduce visual compression on long floors, the system by which housekeeping staff were scheduled to minimize repeat assignments to the same rooms so that guests encountered different people and different small touches rather than the same routine repeated. The way the casino floor was designed so that the exit was never visible from the gaming tables, not to trap people, but to slow the pace of the experience for those who wanted to be slowed. Who designed the floor plan? I asked. Your grandfather consulted on it, actually. When we underwent the last major renovation 6 years ago, he spent 3 days here walking the space with the architects. He had very specific ideas about sightlines and the relationship between the casino and the hotel entrance. He came here? 3 times in my tenure, always with specific objectives. He would arrive, review the operation, ask questions. He was a very good questioner. And then give very clear feedback and leave. He was never intrusive. Ethan glanced at me. He also always asked about the staff before he asked about the numbers. Every time. The numbers were secondary. We were standing at the entrance to the main restaurant, its dinner service not yet begun, the table set in the low afternoon light with the particular stillness of a stage before the performance. He would call quarterly, Ethan continued. Video conference, always prepared, always on time. And every quarter, the first 10 minutes were the same. He would ask me to tell him about 3 staff members who were doing well and 1 who was struggling and what we were doing about it. The financial review came after. I thought about the woman at the Marriott, the cleaning woman who looked at people. He believed the culture produced the numbers, I said, not the other way around. Ethan looked at me for a moment with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. Yes, he said, exactly that. Most owners arrive and go directly to the P&L. He went directly to the people. We stood in the quiet restaurant, and I thought about all the Saturday afternoons on the sun porch, all the questions he had asked me, all the things I had said that I assumed were just conversation. And I understood fully and finally that none of it had been incidental. He had been building a philosophy over decades of careful observation, and he had used those conversations with me partly to refine it and partly to make sure that whoever inherited what he'd built would already understand, in their bones, why it worked. From the restaurant terrace, the harbor was visible below, boats settling into the late afternoon, the light going golden and warm across the water. He was a good owner, Ethan said simply. I'm going to try to be one too, I said. The flight to Macau was 6 hours from Nice through a connection in Zurich. I spent most of it with my laptop open, reading the briefing documents Robert Klein, the Trust's senior financial advisor, a methodical Chicago-born man of 51 who had managed the Trust's investment strategy for the past 11 years, had assembled for me. Natalie Brooks met me at Macau International Airport in a car that was efficient rather than showy, which told me something about her before she said a word. She was 42 years old, from Portland originally, and had been the Imperial Harbor's chief operating officer for 7 years. She was direct in the way of people who have learned that clarity saves time, and she had the specific confidence of someone who is genuinely good at a complicated job and doesn't feel the need to announce it. I've prepared a full operational overview, she said, as we pulled away from the terminal. Revenue breakdown by segment, capital expenditure projections for the next 3 years, and the expansion feasibility study for the Dubai opportunity. She paused. I've also prepared a separate summary in case you'd prefer to start with the high-level picture and get into specifics later. I'll start with the full overview, I said. She nodded with what I thought was a small degree of approval. The Imperial Harbor was everything the Riviera Crown was not. Vast where the Crown was intimate, kinetic where the Crown was composed, 47 floors of gold-tinted glass rising above the harbor with a scale that was designed to register from a distance. Inside, the casino floor was the size of a city block. The hotel suites began on the 30th floor, and the restaurants covered 12 different culinary traditions across 4 levels of the atrium. The numbers matched the scale. $138 million in annual revenue. The casino floor generating roughly 60% of that, the hotel, food and beverage, and entertainment making up the rest, and the margins in those segments growing faster than the casino margins as the team had spent the past 3 years deliberately developing the non-gaming experience. Your grandfather's direction on this, Natalie said, as we sat in the executive suite reviewing the reports, was consistent with what I understand he did everywhere. Build the experience around the guest, not around the revenue mechanism. The casino generates most of the money, but the reason people come back and the reason they tell other people to come is how they feel in the building as a whole. And the Dubai feasibility study, I said. What's your read on it? She looked at me for a moment, the way people look when they're recalibrating. Honestly, the market fundamentals are strong. The site we're looking at is positioned well. The challenge is timing and management depth. We'd be stretching the senior team to open a new property while optimizing this one. What would change that calculus? A longer lead time, 18 months of preparation minimum before groundbreaking, and a partnership structure with a local operator for the first 3 years rather than a wholly owned subsidiary. I wrote that down. Keep the analysis going on that basis. She made a note. Then, without looking up, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Honestly, someone who would need a lot of explanation about why this business works the way it does. My grandfather spent 16 years explaining it to me without either of us knowing that was what he was doing, I said. The moment that changed the direction of the trip came near the end of the second day in an afternoon session with Natalie and Robert Klein on a video call from Chicago. Robert was walking me through the trust's investment parameters, the criteria Edward had established for acquisitions, the risk thresholds, the preference for operating assets over pure financial instruments. When he mentioned, almost as a bridge to the next topic, there are a few domestic targets we've been monitoring at the trust's direction. Logistics companies on the West Coast primarily. One in particular fits the acquisition profile very closely. Strong operational foundation, revenue solid but leveraged heavily from a recent fleet expansion. A capital injection would solve the problem entirely. I looked at him through the screen. Send me the full brief. Of course. Did you have a specific sector in mind, or... I'd like to see everything you have on logistics operators in the San Diego area. Companies with revenue between 20 and 40 million acquired debt in the past 3 years. Robert began to type something on his end. Natalie, beside me at the conference table, was quiet in a way that was paying attention. One more thing, I said. When you pull those profiles, I want to know about employee headcount and tenure. How many people? How long they've been there? Robert looked up. That's not typically part of the acquisition screening. It is now. That evening, alone in the suite, I sat with the preliminary brief Robert had sent within the hour. Coastal Bridge Logistics, San Diego, founded by Mitchell Foster, current sole owner. Annual revenue $28 million. Gross margin 11%. Debt $18 million from a fleet expansion 26 months ago. Cash reserves under $2 million. Current debt service ratio manageable for approximately 6 to 8 months under stable conditions. Employee count, 87. Average tenure, 6.5 years. I read through the document twice. 87 people who had worked for that company for an average of 6.5 years. People who had made decisions about where to live and what cars to drive and whether to send their kids to private school partly based on the assumption that their jobs were stable. I called Sebastian. I want to pursue the Coastal Bridge acquisition, I said. I want the offer structured through a subsidiary entity, nothing traceable to the trust or to me. I want the terms to be genuinely good, not just sufficient. Full debt assumption, above market price, 4-year employment guarantee for all current staff. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. The seller is your father. I know. And he won't know the buyer is you. Not immediately. I paused. Sebastian, I'm not doing this to hurt him. The company is in trouble. The employees are at risk. If someone doesn't come in with capital in the next 6 months, he's going to face some very bad options. I can be the good option. And the fact that you'll own your father's company is a secondary consequence. One I've thought about. I looked out the window at the Macau harbor, dark now, the lights of the other towers reflecting in the water. I want you to name the acquisition entity Crestline Maritime Holdings. Register it in Delaware. Clean structure, legitimate in every respect, and I want the offer ready to present within 4 weeks. 4 weeks is aggressive for proper due diligence. Robert has already done the preliminary screening. I'll authorize the full due diligence team immediately. 4 weeks. Another pause. All right, Sebastian said. 4 weeks. I flew home on a Thursday, landed in San Diego on a Friday morning, and was standing in front of my sophomore English class by Monday. Nothing about my daily life had changed visibly. Same apartment, same commute, same thermos of coffee, same stack of essays, same slightly unreliable showerhead. The students had noticed I'd been absent for a week and asked where I went. I told them I'd had a family matter and a trip abroad, which was both accurate and entirely insufficient, and they accepted it the way students accept most things teachers say about their personal lives, with mild curiosity and rapid disinterest. But evenings were different now. Every evening after dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and the documents Robert Klein sent in the secure portal the trust used for client communications. I was learning, formally, seriously, the way I had once learned to read literary criticism and could now teach it to someone else. Robert had recommended a reading list, which I worked through systematically. Valuation methodologies, acquisition structures, the mechanics of debt assumption in an M&A transaction. Sebastian held a video call with me 3 times a week, usually an hour, working through specific questions I had flagged in the documents. He was a patient teacher. He corrected me without condescension and pushed back when my conclusions were imprecise. "You said the debt assumption makes the deal generous," he said during one of those calls about 2 weeks in. "What specifically makes it generous? Walk me through the seller's perspective." Because the $18 million in debt disappears from the seller's balance sheet as part of the transaction, instead of being deducted from the purchase price. So he receives $38 million in cash and walks away with no liability, rather than receiving $20 million after the debt is netted out. And from the buyer's perspective, what do you give up? You take on the liability. The $18 million becomes your problem, but the business generates enough cash flow to service it comfortably within the new ownership structure, because the trust can absorb the short-term pressure while the business stabilizes. An independent buyer without that capital backing couldn't offer these terms. Correct. And what does that tell you about who the ideal buyer for this company actually is? I thought about that. Someone who can afford to take a long view. Someone for whom the short-term debt service is manageable and the long-term operating value of the business is the actual return. Which is exactly what the trust is. I wrote that down. Robert, separately, was managing the due diligence. The team he'd assembled had worked through the Coastal Bridge financials in 10 days and confirmed the picture I'd already understood. The business itself was well run, the routes were profitable, the customer relationships were strong. The fleet expansion had been strategically sound but financially premature. The company needed capital, not rescue. At the end of week 3, Robert filed the final due diligence report. The offer document was ready to send. I approved it on a Sunday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a student's essay on Fitzgerald open on one side of the laptop and an M&A term sheet on the other. I submitted the approvals, refreshed the email, closed the laptop. In those weeks, I saw my family twice for dinner. The first time, a Sunday at my parents' house, 3 weeks after Monaco. Mitchell talked about the business, the new contracts in the pipeline, the 2 additional vessels they'd put into service that fall, the expansion of the Seattle route. He spoke with the fluent authority of a man who had built something real and knew its mechanics completely. I listened. At one point, I asked what the current debt service coverage ratio looked like on the new fleet financing. He set down his fork. Where did that question come from? Grandpa used to talk about it, I said. He said it was the number that told you how much room you had to breathe. Mitchell looked at me for a long moment. Then, "It's tighter than I'd like, but manageable." He didn't say the number. I already knew it. It was 1.08 with a covenant threshold of 1.10, a margin of 2 basis points from technical default on one of the facility agreements. "Is there anything I can help with?" I asked. "On the administrative side, documentation, anything like that." "I've got it handled," he said. My mother changed the subject. Ryan started a story about a car he'd seen at an auction. The conversation moved on. I ate my dinner and watched my father and thought about 87 people and did not say anything else about coverage ratios. The offer arrived at Coastal Bridge Logistics' registered office on a Tuesday morning in early November. Crestline Maritime Holdings, incorporated in Delaware, extending a formal acquisition offer for 100% of the outstanding equity and associated operating assets. I was writing vocabulary exercises for my third period class when Robert texted, "Offer delivered. Confirmed received by legal contact at 9:47 a.m." My father called at 4:15 that afternoon. "Celia." His voice had the specific quality of a man who has received surprising news and is still calibrating how to process it. "Something unusual happened today." "What's that?" "The company received an unsolicited acquisition offer from a group called Crestline Maritime Holdings, Swiss-based apparently, though they're Delaware incorporated. Our counsel says they're legitimate, specializes in maritime and logistics acquisitions on the West Coast." "That's unexpected," I said. "It is. The offer is... it's very strong. Above book value. Full debt assumption." A pause. "I don't understand why they'd be interested in us specifically. We're not the largest operation in the region." "What does your instinct tell you?" "That they see something I don't." He paused again. "Can you come to dinner Thursday? I want the family there. I'd like another perspective on the paperwork." "Of course, Bai," I said. The Thursday dinner was in a different register than any family dinner I could remember. My father had spread the offer documents across the dining room table before the food was served, something he had never done before. The business had always been his domain, brought home only in the form of mood and distraction, never as literal paper. The offer was $38 million. He stated the number simply, and the room absorbed it. Ryan looked up from his phone. $38 million? Take it. That's almost the same as what you got from the will, and you don't have to do anything. "It's not that simple," Mitchell said. "Why not? You retire. You enjoy it." "Ryan, I'm 58. I'm not ready to retire." Luciana set down her wine glass. "Mitchell, you've been under enormous stress for 2 years. This could be the release valve. And the question," Olivia said from across the table, "is whether you'll regret it. You built that company." While they talked, I was reading. Quietly, steadily, page by page of the offer document, the same document my team had drafted, whose every clause I had approved. "Celia." My mother's voice was gently curious, the way it became when she noticed something she hadn't predicted. "What are you looking at?" "The terms," I said. "Appendix B especially." "What about it?" "The debt assumption is structured as a full release. It doesn't net against the purchase price. Dad, you would receive the full $38 million in cash, and the $18 million in fleet financing disappears from your balance sheet entirely. Crestline takes it on." A silence at the table. My father turned in his chair to look at me directly. "How did you identify that?" "It's on page 7 of the appendix. It's not emphasized, but it's there." I set the document down. That's not standard for a deal this size. A buyer who assumed all the debt and still paid full market rate plus for the equity is either extremely motivated or extremely well capitalized, or both. My father stared at me. "Grandpa used to say the most important thing in any contract was what the other party was willing to give away," I said. "What they're giving away here is the debt assumption. That tells you something about how much they want this." The table was very quiet. "Those are very precise observations," my mother said carefully, "for someone who teaches English." "Grandpa was a good teacher," I said. Mitchell looked at the document. Then he looked at me again with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Not parental, not evaluating, something closer to equal. "Will you look through the rest of it?" he said. "Tell me what you think." "Yes," I said. "I will." And I spent the next 40 minutes going through the document while the family ate dinner around me, conversations happening in the background, and I made notes in the margin the way I made notes on student essays, carefully, precisely, asking questions rather than declaring conclusions. What I found was exactly what I had instructed Robert's team to build. Terms that were genuinely good, structured to solve the seller's problems rather than extract value. The employment guarantees were on page 11. The management continuity clause was on page 14. The price adjustment mechanism that protected Mitchell from any post-closing working capital dispute was buried in Exhibit C. After dinner, while Luciana and Olivia cleared plates, I sat with Mitchell at the table. "My recommendation," I said, "is to accept, with one counter." He looked at me. "Ask for a seat on the advisory board for the first 2 years post-close. Non-voting, consultative only. It gives you a transition role and it signals to the employees that you're still connected to the operation. He was quiet for a long time. Where did you learn to think like this? He said. I thought about the sun porch, the chess games, the questions that I'd always assumed were just conversation. I've been learning for a long time, I said. I just didn't know I was being taught. 5 weeks later, the due diligence period completed, the counter-proposal accepted, the closing mechanics executed by 3 different legal teams. Mitchell Foster signed the transfer documents at 4:51 on a Thursday afternoon. At 5:15, Robert Klein texted me, "Transaction complete. Coastal Bridge Logistics is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Crestline Maritime Holdings." At 5:30, Sebastian called, "Congratulations on your first acquisition." I was standing in my kitchen, still in the clothes I'd worn to school. The evening was coming down gray outside the window. "How do you feel?" Sebastian asked. "I feel like I just did something I can't undo," I said, "which is how I imagine all important decisions feel." "They do," he said. "That's how you know they're the real ones." The employees, nothing changes operationally. Same management, same contacts, same everything. I want the transition to be invisible. I've already briefed Natalie on those parameters. She'll coordinate with the local management team. And my father. He's been told he's welcome to continue in his current role under the new ownership structure, which is true. He doesn't know the ownership structure. "No," Sebastian said, "not yet." And I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment in the quiet and thought about 87 people who were going to wake up tomorrow morning and go to work at the same company they'd always worked at, without knowing that the company had changed hands, or that the person who now owned it had been in the same room as them at Christmas parties and summer barbecues and birthday dinners for all 28 years of their lives. I thought about the decisions I'd made and the reasons I'd made them. I thought they were the right ones. I also thought that they would have consequences I couldn't fully predict. Both of those things were true, and I held them both without trying to resolve them. Diana Caldwell had sold more than 300 properties in San Diego over a career of 22 years, and she had developed, over those 2 decades, a precise taxonomy of buyers. She could identify within the first 10 minutes which category a client fell into: aspirational, practical, status-driven, transitional, and calibrate her approach accordingly. I confused her within the first 5. We met at her office on a Tuesday morning in mid-November. She was 50 years old, composed and professional, the kind of agent who dressed as well as her listings because she understood that the presentation was part of the service. I had emailed ahead with a budget range and a simple brief: primary residence, San Diego, something significant. She showed me 4 properties that morning. I asked good questions at each: structural, zoning, sightlines, carrying costs. She answered well. By the 4th property, I could see that she had stopped trying to categorize me and was simply paying attention. The 5th property was Silver Ridge Estate. It sat on 18 acres above the Torrey Pines area, accessed through an iron gate at the end of a private road that wound through mature Torrey Pines and coastal sage. The house itself was modern, built 12 years ago by an architect who had designed 3 other houses in California that had been featured in national publications, and it showed in the restraint of the design. No showboating, just proportion, materiality, and light handled very well. From the main terrace, San Diego lay below in its full topographic range: the canyons, the coast, the bay, the downtown skyline 10 miles south. To the east, the mountains. To the west, the Pacific, flat and enormous. And in the middle ground, identifiable if you knew where to look, the grid of a residential neighborhood I had driven through several hundred times. The asking price was $21.5 million. I stood on the terrace for approximately 45 seconds. "I'd like to make an offer," I said. Diana turned from the view. "Would you like to see the lower level before full asking price, cash, close in 3 weeks?" She looked at me the way the Swiss banker had looked at me, which is to say, with the careful neutrality of a professional whose inner experience was not matching their outer expression. "Miss Foster," she said, "this is a $21.5 million property." "I know, I can read the listing." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "May I ask, what industry are you in?" "Asset management," I said. "Real estate, hospitality, logistics." She nodded slowly, the taxonomy fully abandoned. "I'll draw up the offer this afternoon." "One thing," I said before we turned back toward the house. "I'd like the closing to be quiet, No announcement, no press contact. Of course. I called Robert from the driveway. Wire transfer instructions confirmed. 3-week close initiated. That evening, I sent my mother a text message. Moving next week. New place. Can you and Dad come see it? I'll send the address. She replied immediately. Of course. Can't wait to see your new place. I sent her the Silver Ridge address and put my phone in my pocket. Then I stood in my small apartment, the one with the unreliable showerhead and the sticking drawer and the 4 years of accumulated daily life in every corner. And I looked at it for a long time. I was going to miss it, I realized. Not because it was the last thing I had before everything changed, but because it was where I had been myself, fully, without any of this. The trust, the meetings in Monaco, the documents and decisions and wire transfers. It was where I had been just a teacher who graded papers at 6 in the morning and made cold coffee and was good at her job and not much else, according to most of the people who had known her. I had been wrong about that, as it turned out, and so had they. I packed the photograph last, wrapped it carefully in a sweater, and set it at the top of the box. Somewhere that matters, he had said. I understood that now. Moving day was a Friday in late November, cold and bright the way San Diego gets in late autumn. The sky a hard, particular blue, the air carrying just enough edge to make you feel awake without being unpleasant. The relocation company arrived at 8. There were 6 of them, professional and efficient, and by 9:30 the truck was loaded with the furniture I had ordered over the previous 3 weeks, pieces chosen not for display but for use, the kind of furniture that invites people to stay rather than asking them to admire. A few things came from the old apartment. My bookshelves, my kitchen table, the small framed photograph that had lived on every surface I'd ever owned. I placed that one personally in the office before the movers finished with anything else. At 10, I sent my mother the text I had composed the night before. We're all set. Come whenever you're ready. The gate code is 4412. She replied, on our way. So excited to see your new place. I stood on the front terrace with a cup of coffee and waited. I heard the car before I saw it. My parents' sedan came through the iron gate at the end of the private road and moved slowly up the approach, winding through the Torrey pines that lined both sides. The driver's side window was down slightly, which meant my mother was looking out of it, which meant she had already seen enough to be confused. The car stopped in the circular driveway behind the moving truck and sat there for a moment with the engine running. Then it turned off. They got out the way people get out of cars when their legs aren't entirely sure of the ground, carefully, with a hand on the doorframe. My mother stood on the near side and looked at the house the way you look at something your brain is refusing to fully process. My father stood on the far side of the car with both hands resting on the roof and his eyes moving slowly across the facade, the terrace, the windows, the scale of it. I set my coffee down on the terrace railing. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. I walked down the front steps. Come inside. My mother looked at me, then at the house, then at me again. The expression on her face was not one I had seen before. It was the expression of a woman whose internal model of a situation has just failed completely and who has not yet had time to build a new one. Celia, she said. Just that. Come on, I said. I'll show you around. The house did what it was designed to do, which was to make space feel like something you inhabited rather than something you stood inside. The entrance hall had a ceiling that climbed to 18 feet and a wall of glass on the far side that framed the coastal scrub of the hillside and, beyond it, sky. Light moved through the whole structure in a way that changed as you walked, pooling in the lower rooms, flooding the upper floors, present everywhere without effort. I walked them through it the way Ethan Laurent had walked me through the Riviera Crown, not to impress, but to understand. The kitchen, with the island where 4 people could work at once. The library, its floor-to-ceiling shelves already half filled with the books I'd been pulling from boxes since early morning. The study, the guest rooms, the terraces on 2 levels. Neither of my parents said much. They were processing. I could see it, the way their eyes moved over surfaces and spaces and then came back to me as if trying to reconcile the 2 things into a coherent picture. Finally, on the upper terrace, with the city laid out below us and the Pacific a flat silver line at the western edge of the view, my father turned to me. Celia. His voice had the quality of a man choosing his words with unusual care. You need to explain this to me. I know, I said. This is Silver Ridge Estate. This sold 3 weeks ago. I saw it in the property records. I look at high-end commercial comps sometimes and this came up. $21.5 million. 21.5, I said. Full asking. Cash close. A silence that had real weight. Where did the money come from? my mother said. Her voice was not loud. She was holding herself very still. I looked at them both, my father with his hands in his coat pockets, my mother with her arms crossed against the cold, both of them standing on a terrace that overlooked a city they had lived in for 30 years and suddenly looking as though they had never seen it before. "Do you remember the envelope?" I said. My father's expression shifted. "There's no way an envelope. Not the envelope itself, what it pointed to." I turned to face them fully. Grandpa created a trust for me when I turned 18. He named me as the sole beneficiary and structured it so that the full extent of it would only be disclosed to me when I turned 28. He didn't tell anyone, not his attorneys beyond Daniel Hartley and Sebastian Whitmore, not any of you. "A trust," my mother repeated. "He spent 27 years building an international portfolio, hospitality properties, commercial real estate, private equity positions. He put it all into the trust. The net value as of last month is approximately $980 million. The silence this time was the kind that has a physical quality, like the silence just after a very loud sound, when the air is still rearranging itself. My mother sat down on the terrace bench behind her, not deliberately, her legs simply required it. My father did not sit. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked out at the city for a long time. "He never said a word," Mitchell said finally. "In 30 years, he never once mentioned," he told Sebastian Whitmore, "that if you knew, it would change the way you treated me. And he wanted me to be seen for who I was before I had anything that made it easy to see me." My father was quiet. "Did it work?" my mother asked softly. She was not asking about the money. I looked at her. "I know who I am," I said. "Yes, it worked." We were inside by then, in the living room, the three of us with the awkward stillness of people in a conversation that doesn't have a familiar shape. My father was sitting now in one of the chairs by the window, his elbows on his knees. My mother held a glass of water I had brought her without being asked. "I need to tell you something else," I said. Mitchell looked up. I took out my phone, opened the email from Robert, and turned the screen toward my father. He read it. His eyes moved from left to right, then went back to the top and read it again. Then he set the phone down on the coffee table between us and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in all the years I had been his daughter. "Crestline Maritime Holdings," he said. "That's you. That's one of the trust's subsidiary entities. Yes, you bought my company. I bought a profitable company with a debt problem from a willing seller at above market terms with full debt assumption. That's the transaction." I paused. "The seller happens to be my father. Celia. The 87 people who work there will show up Monday morning and nothing will have changed. Same managers, same routes, same everything. The debt is gone. The cash flow pressure is gone. The company can grow now without fighting its own balance sheet." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "You should have told me." "Would you have sold to me if you'd known?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "No," I said. "You wouldn't have. You would have felt like I was taking something from you. And I would have had to explain how I knew about the coverage ratio and the fleet financing and the 6-month runway. And we would have had a different conversation, one where you were managing your pride instead of making a business decision. This way you made a good decision, for the company and for the people in it." "You managed me," he said. Not with anger, with something more complicated than anger. Grandpa always said the best moves aren't the ones the other player doesn't see coming. They're the ones where, afterward, the other player looks at the board and can't argue with the result. I met his eyes. "Can you argue with the result?" A long silence. "The employees are protected," he said. 4-year guarantee. The debt is cleared. Entirely. And the company can still grow. Better positioned for it now than before." He looked out the window. The city below was moving through its Friday afternoon in complete indifference to the conversation happening above it. "No," he said finally. "I can't argue with the result." My mother reached across the coffee table and put her hand over mine. This time the gesture did not feel like performance. It felt like a woman in her mid-50s sitting in her daughter's living room and understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full shape of what she had missed. "How long have you known all of this?" she said. 6 weeks. "And you didn't say anything." I needed to understand it first, and I needed to make some decisions before I stopped. Then, I needed to know I could do it on my own before I brought it into this family. Because once I brought it in, it would stop being about what I could do and start being about what you all thought I should do. And I wasn't ready for that conversation until I had already shown myself and you what the answers actually were. My mother was quiet for a moment. That's very like your grandfather, she said. I know. Ryan arrived unannounced at Silver Ridge on a Sunday afternoon, 2 days after my parents' visit. I watched the gate camera when the buzzer sounded and saw him standing at the intercom in a jacket and jeans, hands in his pockets, looking at the camera with an expression that was trying to appear casual and not entirely succeeding. I buzzed him in. He drove up the approach slowly and parked behind my car and got out and looked at the house for a long moment before coming to the door. I opened it before he knocked. So it's true, he said. Come in. He walked through the entrance hall and into the living room and stood at the window, looking out at the view with the silence of someone who is buying themselves time. Dad told me everything, he said. I expected he would. The trust, the company. He turned from the window. You bought Dad's company. I did. He looked at me, really looked, the way he very rarely had, with the evaluating directness of someone taking stock rather than skimming. Why didn't you say anything? At dinner, when Dad was talking about the offer, you sat there and asked questions about the appendix and you already knew exactly what was in it because you wrote it. I wrote the parameters. My legal team wrote the document. That's not the point, Celia. No, I agreed. The point is that I had good reasons for handling it the way I did, and the point is also that I'm not apologizing for it. I sat down on the couch. After a moment, he sat across from me. The company is in better shape than it was 3 weeks ago. The employees are protected. Dad has $38 million and no debt and an advisory board seat if he wants it. Those are the facts. Ryan was quiet. He was looking at his hands. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. He looked up. Are you happy? I mean, actually. Not the PR version. The question surprised me, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was the last question I had expected from him. I thought about it seriously. I'm the most like myself I've ever been, I said. Whether that's the same thing as happy, I'm still figuring out. But I don't think I've ever been more certain of anything than I am of the decisions I've made in the past 6 weeks. Ryan nodded slowly. He looked back at his hands. I've been thinking about something, he said, since Dad told me, about the way things have always been in this family. A pause. I've never had to work for anything. Not really. Everything I've had has come from Dad or from Grandpa or from just being a foster and having that open doors. And I used to think that was normal. Or if not normal, then at least fine. He stopped. Watching what you've done in 6 weeks, knowing that you built the understanding to do it over years, quietly, without anyone paying attention. I don't know how to explain what that felt like to realize. How did it feel? Like I've been playing a game I thought I was good at and finding out I never actually understood the rules. I looked at my brother, 31 years old, sitting in my living room, saying something true for the first time in a conversation with me that I could remember. The rules aren't that complicated, I said. You pay attention, you do the work. You don't assume the door will open because it opened before. Is it too late to start? I studied him. Not the version of Ryan I had carried in my head for 28 years. The one who leaned back in chairs and barely listened and made jokes at the wrong times. The one in front of me who had driven here on a Sunday and asked a question he didn't have to ask. No, I said, it's not too late. He exhaled slowly, like someone setting something down that they'd been carrying for a while without realizing it. I don't want anything from you, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not here because of the money. I know, I said. If you were here because of the money, you would have come Thursday. You would have come with a lawyer. Something in his expression shifted, the small specific shift of someone who has been seen accurately. What would you do? He said. If you were me, I'd find something I could build, I said. Something where the result was mine, all the way through. Not a favor, not a position, not a title. Something where you could look at it in 10 years and say, I made that. He was quiet for a long time after that. When he left, he shook my hand at the door. Not a hug, not the reflexive social gesture of family obligation. A handshake, the kind you give when you're making a commitment you intend to keep. Olivia came 3 days later, and the conversation was shorter and, in its own way, more direct. She came alone, without Derek. She sat in the kitchen while I made coffee, and she looked around the room with the careful attention of someone who is letting themselves acknowledge something they had spent time avoiding. "I owe you an apology," she said, "from the will reading." I set a mug in front of her. "Which part?" "The part where I implied that whatever you'd received was appropriate for your position." She wrapped both hands around the mug. I knew what I was doing when I said it. I wasn't confused or careless. I said it to diminish you, and I knew it would land, and I said it anyway. She looked at me directly. "That was cruel, and I'm sorry." There was no theater in it, no bid for forgiveness, no maneuvering. Just a woman in her early 30s saying a true and uncomfortable thing. "Thank you," I said. "I mean that." "Do you?" She studied me. "Or are you being polite?" "Both can be true," I said. "The apology matters. It doesn't undo the moment, but it matters anyway." She nodded. We drank our coffee. After a while, the conversation moved into easier territory. Her work, the Palm Beach property she'd inherited and wasn't sure what to do with. The general bewilderment of being a person navigating an unexpected inheritance. She was funnier than I remembered when she wasn't performing for a room. When she left, I stood at the kitchen window and thought about the will reading, the conference room, the mahogany table, the specific weight of that silence when Daniel Hartley had said my name and placed a single envelope in front of me. I had thought in that moment that it was the worst day of my life. I understood now that it was the first day of this one. Sebastian flew to San Diego in December, which he told me he rarely did for clients. He met me at Silver Ridge on a Thursday morning with a leather document case and a demeanor that was slightly different from his usual composed efficiency. More careful, somehow. More deliberate. "There's a separate set of materials," he said when we were seated in the study. "Not financial documents, personal ones. Your grandfather stipulated that they were to be delivered only after you had disclosed the trust to your immediate family and the initial conversations had taken place. His instruction was, not before she's had to say the hard things out loud. After that, she'll be ready for these." He placed a sealed envelope on the desk between us. "I'll give you some time," Sebastian said and stepped out. Inside the envelope was a smaller envelope and a note in my grandfather's handwriting, a single line. "For Mitchell, when the time is right, you'll know when." Inside the smaller envelope were 5 letters. I read them in order, which was the order they were dated, the earliest from 8 years ago and the most recent from 4 months before his death. They were written to my father. Not the kind of letters you write when you intend to send them. There were no dates of delivery, no postmarks, no evidence that they had ever left my grandfather's desk. They were the letters a man writes when he needs to say something and cannot yet find the form that would allow him to say it to another person's face. The first was short. It described a Sunday dinner 8 years ago at which Mitchell had interrupted Celia 4 times in the course of a single conversation. Not aggressively, not intentionally, simply, reflexively, in the way of people who have never been required to notice when they're doing it. The letter didn't accuse, it observed. "You didn't hear her today?" my grandfather had written. "I watched her stop trying after the 3rd time. I don't think you saw that. I think you would want to, if you knew." The second letter was from 5 years ago, describing a conversation at which I had asked a question about business cash flow at the dinner table and my mother had redirected the conversation. "She already understands more than you think," the letter said. "More than most people in that room. I don't know why this is so difficult to see. I think perhaps it's because she looks like she's always been fine, and so the assumption is that she is." The third was different in tone, quieter, more inward. My grandfather writing not about a specific incident, but about a specific regret, that he had not said these things to Mitchell directly years earlier, when saying them might have changed something rather than simply named it. I tell myself I was protecting her, that if I drew attention to what she wasn't getting, it would make her more conscious of it. But the truth is that I found it easier to compensate than to confront, and that is my failure, not yours alone. The fourth letter was a year old. By then, my grandfather knew he was dying, and the letter had the quality of a document written by someone who understands their time is finite and is trying to leave things in better order than they found them. It was the most direct of the 5. It named specific moments, specific choices. It did not ask for guilt. It asked for attention. "You are not a cruel man, Mitchell. You are a man who learned to look at certain things and not others, the way all of us do, and who never had reason to question that until now. I'm giving you reason. The 5th letter was dated 4 months before he died. 4 sentences. I don't know if I'll have the chance to say this in person. I hope I do. But in case I don't, she is the best of both of us, and neither of us deserved her. Do better. I sat in the study for a long time after I finished reading. Outside the window, the December light was low and soft, the kind that belongs to the short days of early winter, coming in at an angle that made everything it touched look considered. I thought about what it took to write 5 letters over 8 years and never send them. The accumulation of that, the patience of it, the longing of it. The way some people carry the things they need to say until the saying is no longer possible, and then find other ways to let them land. He had left them for me to deliver. He had known I would know when. I drove to my parents' house that evening and sat at the kitchen table with my father while my mother was in the next room. I placed the envelope in front of him. "Grandpa wrote these," I said. "He left them with Sebastian. They were always meant for you." Mitchell looked at the envelope, then at me. "I haven't read them," I said. That was not entirely true. I had read every word, but the truth I meant was more precise than that. I had not read them looking for ammunition. I had read them looking for understanding. He wrote them over 8 years. Sebastian said he never sent them. Why not? I think he believed showing was more useful than telling. He showed you by building the trust. He showed me by preparing me for it. I paused. He ran out of time to show you some things, so he left these instead. Mitchell picked up the envelope. "You don't have to read them tonight," I said. "I know." He held it in both hands. "But I will." I stood up. "I'm going to say goodbye to Mom." He didn't answer. He was already looking at the envelope with the focused stillness of a man who has been told that something important is in front of him and is deciding slowly to believe it. He called 3 days later. It was a Tuesday morning, just past 7. I was at the kitchen table with coffee and a briefing document from Robert, same as most mornings now, same table as always, same kitchen light. "I read them," he said. "I know." A pause. "He wrote about that dinner 8 years ago, the Sunday at your Aunt Patricia's. Do you remember it?" Vaguely. "I interrupted you 4 times. He counted." His voice was careful. Each word set down the way you set down something fragile. "I don't remember interrupting you. I don't have any memory of it at all. That's the part that..." He stopped. "That's the part that's been hardest to sit with. Not that I did it, but that it was invisible to me." I was quiet. "He wrote, in the last one," Mitchell paused. "He said you were the best of both of us." "I read that one too," I said. "I'm sorry, Celia. Not because of the money or the company or the house. I'm sorry because I had a daughter who was paying close attention to everything in every room she was in for 28 years, and I was not paying close attention to her." The morning light came through my kitchen window the way it always did. Pale in autumn, thinner than summer, still reliable. "I know," I said. "Is that enough? Knowing?" "It's the beginning of enough," I said. "The rest depends on what comes next." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What comes next, for what it's worth, is that I would like to understand what you're building, not to be involved in it or to have a stake in it, just to understand it. Because I think I missed about 20 years of a version of you that was always there, and I'd like to stop missing it." I thought about the sun porch, the chess games, the questions. "Come to dinner Sunday," I said. "I'll tell you about Monaco." Sebastian's second visit to San Diego came 2 weeks after the first, and this time he brought a separate file, thinner than the financial documents, no letterhead, no formal structure. "Your grandfather left one more set of instructions," he said. "He specified that this conversation should happen after the family conversations had settled. His words were, 'After she's done the hard things, there's one more thing she needs to know, not about the money, about me.'" He opened the file and placed a single page on the desk. It was a personnel record from 30 years ago. The name at the top was Gerald Holt. Position: Regional Operations Manager, Foster Hospitality Group. Status: terminated. Sebastian told me the story without embellishment. My grandfather, at 52, the same year he met Sebastian, the same year the portfolio began to grow in earnest, had been under pressure to cut costs ahead of a refinancing. Gerald Holt was a 10-year employee, loyal and effective, but his salary was the largest in the regional operations team. He was 38 years old. His wife was 7 months pregnant with their second child. My grandfather made the call. Gerald was let go with 2 weeks severance and a letter of recommendation that got him nowhere for 2 years. The family burned through their savings. The marriage survived, but barely. Gerald eventually found work in a different industry at significantly lower pay and never returned to hospitality. Your grandfather tried to reach him, Sebastian said, twice, directly, and once through an intermediary. Gerald didn't respond. He had a right not to. And so, Grandpa, when he established your trust, he created a secondary disbursement, $120,000 per year, paid anonymously through a private charitable structure to an account in Gerald Holt's wife's name, classified as an educational and family support grant from an unnamed foundation. Sebastian looked at me. Gerald has been receiving that payment for 10 years. He doesn't know where it comes from. His children have gone to college. His wife has a small business they rebuilt. I looked at the page. He put it in your trust, I said. He made it part of the ongoing obligation, not as penance. Or at least that's how he described it to me, as a reminder. He said, every time I review the trust documents, I want to see that line. I want to know what it costs to make the wrong call for the wrong reason, and I want whoever inherits this to know it too. I was quiet for a long time. Does Gerald know about the trust? About me? No. He knows only that the payments come from a private foundation. He has never tried to identify the source. I want to continue the payments, I said. Increase them to $200,000 annually. I paused. And I want you to reach out to Gerald, not from me, not yet, and find out whether his children have any educational or professional needs that aren't being met. If they do, I want a separate scholarship structure established for them. Sebastian wrote this down. And the last part, I said, at some point, not now, but at some point, I want Gerald to know, not for my sake, because I think he deserves to know that the man who made that decision spent 30 years trying to account for it. That's not nothing. He should know it. Sebastian nodded. Your grandfather said you would handle it this way. Did he? His exact words were, she'll do more than I did. She always does. I looked at the photograph on the desk. Him and me, cream-colored stone, autumn light, his face turned toward a building and wearing an expression I had finally learned to read. I had thought, when I first understood what all of this was, that the greatest gift was the money. Then I thought it was the preparation. Then the time. But sitting in my study on a December afternoon with a file about a man named Gerald Holt on the desk in front of me, I understood that the greatest gift was the accountability, the deliberate, unflinching record of a mistake and its cost, left where I would have to look at it. He hadn't handed me a fortune and a philosophy. He had handed me a fortune, a philosophy, and the specific failure that the philosophy was built in response to. That was the whole picture. That was the inheritance. The months that followed were not dramatic. That is, I think, the most honest thing I can say about them. Real change, the kind that holds, tends to be undramatic. It is made of repeated small choices accumulating in the same direction over time until one day you look back and the distance from where you started is genuinely surprising, even though every individual step was small. January and February were largely administrative. I resigned from Jefferson High at the end of the fall semester, which was harder than I expected. Not the resignation itself, but the last day, the last class, the particular quality of a room full of 15-year-olds who did not know what was changing and therefore said goodbye the way people say goodbye when they expect to see you again. I kept my connection with the school in a different form, a small endowment that funded classroom libraries and covered the cost of AP exam fees for students who couldn't afford them. Emily Weston, who had been my closest friend since our third year of teaching and who knew me better than anyone in my life, sat with me in the Silver Ridge kitchen the week after my last day and listened to the full version of the story. All of it, the numbers, the properties, the company, the letters, Gerald Holt, and said very little until I finished. Then she said, "Are you the same person?" "Yes," I said. "That's the part I'm most sure of." "Good," she said, "because I didn't sign up to be friends with a billionaire. I signed up to be friends with you." With Coastal Bridge, the transition was exactly what I had promised it would be, invisible from the outside. Mitchell continued in his role. The management team continued in theirs. The routes ran. The contracts were fulfilled. The first board meeting, the first one at which Mitchell was a participant rather than the principal, was uncomfortable for approximately the first 20 minutes, in the particular way of situations where the power dynamic has shifted and both parties are still calibrating what the new shape feels like. Then Mitchell asked a question about the expansion of the Seattle route that was genuinely good, specific, operationally informed, the question of someone who understood the business from the inside. And the meeting became a meeting, and we both stopped noticing the discomfort because the work was more interesting than it. He was wrong once, in those early months, about a contract. He wanted to sign quickly, bypassing the risk review process because the client relationship was long-standing and he trusted his read of it. I held the process. He was frustrated. The review revealed that the client's parent company had been restructured and the entity we were contracting with had no independent credit standing. Mitchell didn't comment when the review came back. He signed the revised paperwork, which included an enhanced payment security structure. At the next board meeting, he mentioned it. "You were right about the review process," he said. "I wanted to go on instinct. The instinct was based on incomplete information." "That's what the process is for," I said. "I know." He looked at me steadily. "I'm learning to trust it." Ryan started at Coastal Bridge in February. Entry-level, logistics coordination, the role that involved the most administrative detail and the least visibility. He was not immediately good at it. This was expected. What was not expected, not by me, and I think not by him, was that he stayed. Through the tedious weeks, the learning curve, the specific indignity of being 31 and asking a 24-year-old colleague to explain a piece of software, he stayed, and gradually he became less bad at it, and eventually he became adequate, and by late spring he was beginning to show flashes of something that I recognized from a different angle than I expected. He was good with clients. Not the paperwork, not the systems, but the people. The actual phone call, the conversation where something had gone wrong and someone needed to feel heard before they would accept a solution. He called me one Saturday morning in April. "I think I understand something you said about finding something you built." "What do you understand about it?" "That the building part has to come before you get to feel good about it. You have to do the part where you're not good yet." "Yes," I said. "That's it exactly." Spring arrived fully in May, and with it the monthly family dinners had become, over 4 months, something that none of us had found a word for yet, but that all of us came to. The table at Silver Ridge seated 12. Most months we filled 8 seats. Mitchell and Luciana, Ryan, Olivia, and Derek, Emily when she could, and occasionally Sebastian when he was in town and accepted the standing invitation I had extended on the grounds that he had known my grandfather longer than I had, and his presence made the room feel more complete. The dinner in May was an ordinary one in most respects. There was a question Mitchell asked me about the Dubai feasibility study. There was a story Ryan told about a client call that had gone unexpectedly well. Luciana had brought a lemon cake that she'd made from a recipe she found in the Napa Valley house. One written in my grandmother's handwriting on a card tucked inside a cookbook, a small discovery she had made during her first full visit to the property. After the cake, when the table had gone quieter and the conversation had slowed into the comfortable register of people who have been fed and are not ready to leave, my mother set down her fork and looked at me. "Can I ask you something I've been sitting with for a while?" "Of course." "When you bought the company, when you arranged all of it quietly without telling any of us, part of that was strategic. I understand that." She paused. "But was any of it anger?" The table was attentive but unhurried. This was the kind of question that 4 months ago would have been impossible to ask. Too direct, too much in the territory that my family had always navigated around rather than through. "Yes," I said. "Some of it was anger. Some of it, I won't pretend otherwise." I looked at her. "At the will reading, you told me that Grandpa probably didn't love me quite as much as I thought. I know you said it without thinking about it fully, but it landed." My mother was very still. "I made good decisions," I said. "I also made them in the knowledge that I was finally in a position where being underestimated had a different kind of cost than it used to. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I'm not ashamed of either of them." "You had every right to be angry," Luciana said quietly. I did. "I'm sorry for that comment. I've thought about it since the day you moved in here. It was the most unkind thing I said, and I said it without even registering that it was unkind, which is its own kind of sorry thing." "I know," I said. "I've believed you for a while now." She reached across the corner of the table and put her hand over mine. This time it felt like what it was supposed to be. Later, Mitchell and I stood on the lower terrace, the city lights beginning to intensify as the evening deepened. Spring in San Diego had a quality of gentle insistence. The jasmine coming up along the terrace wall, the air softer than winter without being summer's fullness yet. "I want to say something while it's just us," he said. I waited. "I've spent a lot of time this year thinking about your grandfather's letters, not about the content exactly, I've processed that, but about the fact that he wrote them." He looked at the city. He watched something happening for 8 years, and he wrote it down, and he couldn't bring himself to say it to my face. I've been asking myself why, and I think the answer is that he didn't trust that I would hear it. Not because I'm a bad person, because I had never given him evidence that I was capable of hearing it. "That's honest," I said. "The thing I've been trying to understand is, what changed? What made it possible for me to hear it now, when I couldn't before?" I thought about it. "The board meetings," I said, "not because of authority, because you started working with someone who expected you to engage rather than decide, and you found out you could." He turned to look at me. "You mean working with you. I mean working in a structure where someone held you accountable. The structure matters. Your grandfather knew that. He built his entire career on it," I said. "He never trusted informal accountability. He built the processes and the frameworks and the board structures because he understood that good intentions without structure produce the same results as bad intentions without structure." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "Teach me," he said. "That's what I want to ask. Not to be in charge of anything you're building. Not a role or a title. I want to understand how you think about these things. The way you asked me to teach you to run a company when you were 22 and I told you I didn't have time." I looked at him. "You told me that?" I said. He met my eyes. "You asked me once if you could come to work with me for a summer and learn the operations. You were in college. I told you I didn't have time to supervise an intern." He paused. I didn't think about it again until I was reading Grandpa's letters and he mentioned it. He wrote that he was there when I said it and he watched your face. I didn't remember. I had forgotten, in the long accumulation of similar moments, the specific shape of that one. "Yes," I said. "I'll teach you." He exhaled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. It's a real commitment. I'll expect you to do the reading and to come to the meetings prepared and to ask questions when you're confused rather than pretending otherwise." "I can do that." "I know you can," I said. "That was never the question." We stood on the terrace until the city was fully lit below us, the bay dark and the hills dark and the lights between them tracing the shape of 30 years of other people's ordinary lives, all of it visible from here, all of it part of something larger than any single view could contain. The Edward Foster Foundation for Workforce Education launched on a Thursday morning in June in a room that held 40 people, representatives from 6 San Diego area community colleges, 3 regional logistics companies, 2 hospitality groups, and a small team from the foundation's staff. I stood at the front of the room and said the things I had written and rewritten over 3 weeks. What the foundation was, what it intended to do, why the logistics and hospitality sector specifically, what the first grants would fund, what the accountability structures looked like. And then I said the part I had not written down, because the written version had never sounded right. My grandfather built a significant portion of what I now steward over the course of 44 years. He made good decisions and some bad ones, and he was honest with himself about both. He left me the good decisions as a foundation and the bad ones as a lesson, and I think that combination is more useful than the good decisions alone would have been. I looked at the room, at the people who had come to understand what was being offered, what would be expected, what it would mean in practical terms for the people they worked with. The workers this foundation serves will not, most of them, end up owning anything. They will end up with skills that are more durable than the job market shifts that are currently removing the jobs they have. That's the goal. Not a grand transformation, a more solid floor. Emily was at the back of the room. She caught my eye and gave the small nod that meant that was the right thing to say. After the room had cleared, I sat alone for a few minutes before the foundation's program director came back in to debrief. I took out my phone and looked at the photograph I had taken the first morning at Silver Ridge, before the movers arrived, before anyone else had walked through the door, the house empty and still, the morning light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the study and laying itself across the floor in long parallel strips exactly the way the light had done in Sebastian Whitmore's office in Monaco. I had taken the photo because I wanted to remember what it looked like before it became mine, in the way that living in a place makes it yours. Before the books were on the shelves and the photograph was on the desk, and the particular rhythms of my specific life had settled into its rooms. I wanted to remember what it had looked like on the day it was still just a possibility. Autumn came around again, and with it the particular quality of October light, pale and uncommitted, suggesting warmth without delivering it. 1 year since the will reading. 1 year since a white envelope on a mahogany table had divided a family into those who had received something and one person who appeared to have received nothing. I was sitting on the lower terrace at Silver Ridge on a Sunday morning with coffee and the Sunday briefing package from Robert, which now ran to 12 pages each week and covered properties in 5 countries. The Dubai acquisition had been approved in July and was in early site preparation. The London portfolio had added a 3rd property, a commercial building in Shoreditch that the investment team had been tracking for 2 years. The Monaco resort had completed its terrace expansion in August, and the reviews, in the first full season since completion, were the best in the property's history. Net value of the Foster Legacy Trust as of the prior Friday, $1,040,000,000. 1 year. Robert had noted in the weekly summary that the increase since the trust's activation was approximately 6%. Reasonable, unspectacular, the kind of growth that compounds reliably over decades rather than making headlines. My grandfather had built the whole thing on exactly that principle. Nothing that required spectacular outcomes to survive. Everything designed to grow steadily and withstand pressure. I had tried to build in the same way. The family dinners had continued. They would continue. They were, by now, something different than the word family dinner had meant to me for the first 28 years of my life. Not a performance of togetherness, not an obligation dressed in warmth. Just people who shared a history and were, slowly, learning to share the present as well. Mitchell was 3 months into what we had informally titled his education, 2 evenings a week, working through the frameworks that Sebastian had used with my grandfather, applied to the specific context of the portfolio we were now building together. He was a good student, which surprised neither of us more than it surprised us both. He asked questions, he admitted confusion, he had stopped performing certainty. Ryan had been promoted to a client relationship role at Coastal Bridge, which was an acknowledgement of where his actual aptitude lay and not a favor. He had asked me before accepting whether I had approved the promotion. I told him that I had not been consulted and would not be, that promotions in the company were the operations team's decision, and mine only in the extreme case of a dispute, and that he should talk to his manager rather than to me. He thanked me for that. Luciana had begun working with the foundation. Not in a formal capacity, but informally, connecting the foundation's program staff to the network of community organizations she had been involved with for years in a way that turned out to be more useful than any of us had anticipated. She had a gift for people that I had not fully seen because I had spent too long watching her deploy it in the service of social performance. In the service of something that actually mattered, it was considerable. Olivia, separately, had decided to convert the Palm Beach property into a small event venue focused on arts education fundraising. She had called me to ask whether I thought it was a good idea. I told her I thought it depended entirely on whether it was something she genuinely wanted to build or something she was doing to find a purpose for a property she hadn't asked for. She had been quiet for a moment and then said, "The second one, if I'm honest. But I think I can make it into the first one if I work at it." I told her that was a fine place to start. Gerald Holt had been contacted in September by a representative of the foundation with a straightforward message. The anonymous foundation that had been supporting his family for the past 10 years was prepared to identify itself if he wished to know. He had taken 3 weeks to respond. His response was a single sentence. "Yes. I think I'd like to know." Sebastian flew to Portland and met him in person. He called me afterward. "He cried," Sebastian said. "He didn't say much. He sat with it for a long time and then he said, 'I spent years wondering if it was real, whether it would just stop one day and it would turn out to be a mistake.'" "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was entirely intentional and had always been. I told him the name of the man who had arranged it and when he had arranged it and why." "How did he take it?" "He sat with it for another long time. And then he said, 'I used to be angry at him. I didn't stay angry, but I needed to know that he knew it had mattered.'" Sebastian paused. I told him that Edward Foster had looked at that decision every time he reviewed the trust documents for 27 years, that it was never out of his sight. I was quiet. Did it help? I said. I think so. Yes. Another pause. He asked whether he could write a letter to the family, to you, specifically, since you're the one continuing the work. Tell him yes, I said. Tell him I'll write back. Emily came for coffee on the anniversary Sunday, mid-morning, bringing the kind of pastries that are objectively unnecessary and entirely welcome. We sat on the lower terrace in the October light and talked about nothing in particular for a long time. Her classroom, a book she was reading, a trip she was considering, and it was the best part of my week, the way it always was. After a while, she asked, "What do you think he would say if he could see all of it?" I thought about that. Not quickly. Really thought about it. He would ask me what I'd learned, I said. Not what I'd done, what I'd learned from it. And what would you say? That the hardest thing wasn't the decisions. The decisions were hard, but they had logic. You could work through the logic if you were willing to sit with it long enough. I held my coffee mug in both hands. The hardest thing was learning to let people change, to not carry the fixed version of them in your head after the real version had started to become something different. Emily nodded. Is that what happened? With your family? It's happening, I said. I don't know if it's complete. I don't think these things are ever complete, but it's happening, and it's more than I expected, honestly. I went into it expecting to prove something. I came out of it with something I'd rather have. Which is? I looked at the city below, the canyons and the coast and the bay and the grid of streets that contained 30-some years of a life that had been building towards something nobody in it could fully see. People who are actually trying, I said. That's rarer than money, significantly. That evening, after Emily left, I sat in the study at the desk where the photograph always lived and wrote 2 things. The first was a letter to Gerald Holt. I told him who I was. I told him what I understood about the decision that had affected his family and what my grandfather had built in response to it. I told him that the foundation bore his name in an indirect way, that the reason we funded workforce transition specifically was because my grandfather had understood from his own experience what it cost a person to have the rug pulled out without warning and without recourse. I told him that the payments would continue as long as the foundation existed, and that his children's education fund would be transferred to their direct management on their 30th birthdays, because that had seemed to my grandfather like the right age to receive something you hadn't yet learned to expect. The second thing I wrote was not a letter. It was a note to myself, the kind you write not to record something, but to make it real, to take something from the inside and give it a form that exists outside of you, where it can be looked at. It said, "He always saw you. Now you see yourself. The rest is yours." I read it once, then I folded it and put it in the drawer of the desk, next to the framed photograph of a girl and her grandfather standing in front of a building made of cream-colored stone in the autumn light in a city far from home. She was 12 years old and squinting into the sun, and she had no idea what she was looking at. She did now. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever been the person in the corner of the room, the one who was seen last, the one someone quietly believed in when no one else was looking, then you already know what this story is really about. It was never about the money. It was about the decade before the money, the learning, the chess games, the questions that weren't just conversation. Sometimes the greatest inheritance a person can receive isn't a number in an account. It's the evidence, finally, that someone paid attention. If you've made it all the way here, thank you. Genuinely, thank you. These stories take time, and your time is the most real thing you can offer. If this one was worth it, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. And if there's someone in your life who needs to hear this story, someone who has been underestimated for too long, share it with them. Sometimes we can't say the thing directly. Sometimes we have to hand someone a story and let them find themselves in it. I'll see you in the next one.